more, thank you for joining us. Our next session, the Biohacking Village, celebrates global health ingenuity arising from maker communities with the dynamic perspective of emerging biology, technology, and human enhancement. Whether your interest lies in security, technology, engineering, devices, or fabrication, BHV welcomes unapologetical, enthusiastic innovators. Up first is Nathan Parker, project manager at Helpful Engine.
Hello and welcome to my talk on supply chain mesh networks, open source disaster resilience in a world on fire. My name is Nathan Parker and it's a pleasure to be here today. I want to tell you a story. In March of 2020, a small team of engineers and makers in Colorado transitioned their shop into a prototyping lab. They spent the next couple months developing open source designs for critical medical supplies and devices that were suddenly impossible to find enough of. They worked closely with local hospitals and turned out thousands of units of their new design over the coming months and helped a lot of doctors and nurses stay safe while they worked. After almost 6 months, the group disbanded to find paying work. So is this a feel-good, heartwarming story? Not really. Not because these makers did anything wrong. I know hundreds just like them with the same story to tell all over the world, and they're some of the smartest and most compassionate people I know. The reason it is actually a sad story is this. This is not a brief interruption in service, and these mad sprints of intense effort are noble but also wildly unsustainable, uncoordinated, and underfunded. They, along with thousands of others like them around the world, spend a huge portion of their time, money, energy, health, and labor on simply creating the systems needed to work with their communities and each other. They reinvent wheels, lose valuable data in silos, and even if the design they come up with is the best, the only way you'd know about it is to follow them on Facebook. This clearly doesn't work. Let me put it this way. If you believe that this whole crisis and its cascading global systems failures have been a fluke, a once-in-a-lifetime event after which we can safely resume another 100 years of efficient global supply chains providing for our comfort and security without a hiccup, then I have a cure for COVID to tell you as well. COVID has shown us many of the ways that the global supply chain will fail us when we need it most, and this is by design. Supply chain is a system optimized for efficiency, not resilience. It is optimized for profit, not human and environmental well-being. It has split the world into people who make things they cannot afford to buy and people who buy things they don't know how to make. It is a great way for a few people to make a ton of money, but a terrible way to ensure the survival and well-being of people in general. The system that's been very well suited to deliver goods efficiently in a world where the climate is in a steady state, cost of oil is stable, and geopolitics are predictable. This is not a world any of us live in anymore, and there's no compelling reason to believe that we will again in our lifetimes. So perhaps what we can do is take a closer look at the things that have worked when nothing else has. The systems created on the fly that outperformed federal agencies in the critical first months of disaster response and see what they have to teach us. When supply networks break down in an area or have never served it particularly well in the first place, what you tend to see appear are peer-to-peer networks or mesh networks, which connect local nodes of suppliers, manufacturers, distributors, and customers to each other in a decentralized way. Throughout the COVID crisis, we've seen these types of networks popping up all over the world where local manufacturing firms, maker spaces, and ad hoc groups of engineers have self-organized to create new open source designs for critical supplies and instantiated peer-to-peer localized supply chains to fabricate them. This picture is from a group that a friend of mine spun up in Oakland, California, that received donations of several tons of PET sheets and turned them into tens of thousands of face shields and distributed them to hundreds of thousands of people, or to tens of thousands of people all over the Bay Area. Through one such network, open source medical supplies based in the US, we can confirm more than 16.3 million articles of open source medical supplies were fabricated and delivered, including masks, face shields, gowns, oxygen concentrators, ventilators, and so on, since the end of March. In India, the M19 collective organized around Makers Asylum and built a coalition of 42 partner organizations across the entire country. They produced over 1 million face shields, many of which were exported as donations to places as far away as Kenya and Tennessee. But when Mumbai saw a surge in cases, they had to refocus on providing for those close by. At the height of its operation, the asylum alone received about 200 calls a day from labs and hospitals requesting supplies, and leaned on the full-time dedication to communication staff as the main areas that they sunk their time and energy into. At one point, the roughly 100 leadership staff for this organization were coordinating using a giant WhatsApp group, though each lab managed their own volunteer group internally. Again, this is both wonderful work, noble effort, amazing for something that grew out of nothing. Also, if you've ever tried to organize anything on a giant WhatsApp group, wildly unsustainable. Which leads me to the large print giveth and the small print taketh away. This type of decentralized network approach has shown an enormous amount of promise in the flexibility of its productive capacity, the speed with which it can adapt to changing circumstances, the resilience it has as a network, and the resilience it imparts to the communities that make it up. However, these networks suffer from many challenges that haven't yet been solved. And this makes the majority of these efforts a series of unsustainable sprints rather than a sustainable feature of a society desperately in need of better ways to adapt for the long haul of climate change. These challenges include a great deal of reinventing of wheels, as these self-organized groups have to create not only their own operational structure, but their digital infrastructure from scratch every time. These spontaneous communities spend a huge amount of their available energy, talent, and resources just figuring out how to work with each other, how to pull in a signal from their community about what they need, how to turn that into the thing that they need and get it out to them. I've watched this happen so many times, and the number of people who have come in with excitement and energy to make this happen and burnt out 2-3 months later is tragic. Moreover, I cannot tell you how many hackathons I have seen where well-funded groups of engineers get together to create a kind of functioning prototype that's very exciting that already exists dozens of other places. It is literally easier to create something new from scratch that only kind of works than it is to find the thing that does the exact same thing that's already out there, that's been designed, and just improve on it. All right, anyway. Wheel reinvention. Like I said, most of the solutions that are created in these kind of scenarios are lost in data silos and lakes, disappear when the organizations run out of funding, burn out their volunteers, or disband after the immediate crisis is resolved, and then it all has to be reimagined and rebuilt all over again. Most of the conversations that we're having right now about COVID are the exact same conversations we had 6 years ago about Ebola, and we're going to have them again the next time if we don't figure out a better system for this. This particular crisis is far from over, and the next one is already here. It's important to note here that the difficulty of this challenge only goes up. There is no version of our next 50 years where things get easier. Disasters are not polite, and they do not wait their turn. So we need to keep this in mind as we face this choice. Either we can treat the response of makers and ad hoc peer-to-peer supply chains as a novelty while we wait for things to return to normal, or we can take them seriously. To take them seriously means we need to figure out how to improve on them, support them, integrate them into our society, and scale them globally. The good news is this. Systems we've been building are an example of a well-known type of network called a mesh network, widely known for its resilience and flexibility. One example you've probably heard of is the Tor network. It's not a perfect metaphor, but if you're looking for design principles for building a rock-solid mesh network, you could do a lot worse than to look here. Okay, so what does this actually mean? When we say peer-to-peer supply chains are like a mesh network, what does that actually mean? What would it look like if this thing existed, and how do we think about something that's so abstract? So in the case of a Tor network or this supply chain mesh network, all we're doing is tracing a signal through a network. In information networks like Tor, the signal is purely digital, and it does more or less what we're used to doing. In the case of a supply network, the main inbound signal that we care about is a request, something along the lines of, we need X amount of objects in this location. It depends on the existence of a common open library of possible objects, but more to that in a minute. The demand signal enters the network and is routed based on its header metadata, just like anything else. But in this case, that metadata is a little more interesting. This metadata is like what tools are required to fabricate this thing, what materials are needed in what quantity per unit, what manufacturing process is needed to produce these at a given scale, where is the next node that it's going to, what's the closest qualifying node that can produce these items. So like in a Tor network, every node only knows where its packet goes to next, and so none is aware of the entire chain, even though the packet itself must have a record of its own route to validate things like chain of provenance, if you want to know that the thing that you ordered is actually the thing that was made and so on. But again, all of these are fairly well-solved problems just in a parallel domain. As the system routes your request through the nodes, a node is chosen for its capacity and availability to produce the items requested somewhere close to the exit node where the things actually need to be. When the signal arrives at the relay node, in this case, that's where it's going to be fabricated. The information payload of the signal, which is your design and your instructions, your bill of materials, and quantities, and so on, is converted into physical objects using the tools and local labor at that space. From there, it goes back into the system for the final leg of its journey, where the digital network merges with the logistics network. Depending on circumstances, this can be anything from just dropping it off with UPS, sending it by drone, or walking it over by hand. But the goal is to keep production as close as possible to need. The fact that we can fabricate, any amount of anything in a factory 3,000 miles away doesn't do you any good most of the time, especially as things get more and more crisis heavy. So the term node is still fairly abstract. What does this actually look like in reality? Most of the production nodes that we've seen in cases that I talked about above are maker spaces, fab labs, university prototyping labs. This is obviously the best we can work with in terms of existing infrastructure, but I want to take this idea a step further and strip away some of the complexity that comes from this wildly heterogeneous mix of spaces. If we boil the spaces down to their essential properties and remove the constraints that they have to be big, expensive, and stationary, then some interesting paths open up to us. And I want to talk about one of these here with you really quick before we wrap up. So for those who haven't spent any time in a fab lab, you may or may not know that over the past decade, digital fabrication technologies have become orders of magnitude more effective, accessible, and affordable. Out of the existing libraries of hundreds of open source humanitarian and medical supplies, every single one can be made with some combination of these tools, and all of these tools can fit in some combination in a container. And when you have the robust database of open hardware designs and tools required to fabricate them, then you can start provisioning and deploying containerized microfactories automatically based on the needs of a particular time and place. Technology like Docker enabled this kind of rapid environment configuration and containerization in software development and changed the entire industry. Perhaps we can do so here as well. So to bring it all together, let's imagine a scenario in which we get another combination of disasters, something big enough to disrupt the supply chain for an unknown length of time. Again, this should be the default expectation for all of us from this point on. The Anthropocene is just getting warmed up. So let's say, for example, we have a cell of superstorms completely disrupting transatlantic shipping. Oil supplies are fluctuating wildly, so the cost of shipping goods long distances is now unpredictable. And wildfires are spreading and cities start to burn. Does sound familiar? Suddenly you have thousands of people needing emergency shelter that can last them anywhere from 6 months to years. You need medical supplies, quite possibly water purification, depending on what's happened to the groundwater and so on. Good news is, open and accessible designs for all these things exist, but how do we get them to where they need to be? Now, say you have communities in and around the affected regions who have actually invested in this technology, who have these containerized microfactories either sitting idle or being used for education or workforce development in the downtime, and they can be mobilized immediately when the crisis hits. You can deploy them to, a parking lot. You can deploy them to a warehouse. You can deploy them to wherever a centralized place is. And now you have, designs for, flat pack emergency housing you can make with plywood and a CNC machine. You have designs for water purification systems that you can make with, charcoal, sand, gravel, and a bunch of wood and carpentry tools that will purify water for hundreds of people at a time, and so on. You can start building micro wind turbines to bring in power while you're waiting, so on. So imagine we have the supply chain mesh network in place. Every node is active and unaware. And think about the groups that we talked about earlier that had spent months and months ramping on to be able to meet these needs, but in this very short-term sprint kind of way. Now, no more are they needing to develop new prototypes from scratch when all of the open humanitarian designs are already ready to be deployed. And we're spending months of precious time and hundreds of volunteer hours creating new systems from scratch to connect and coordinate when you can onboard and be in the system up and running in days. Systems that are now held together by volunteers and spreadsheets, making up the shortfall where governments and corporations are failing, keeping their families and communities alive, can instead pour their whole effort into doing the work that matters most when it comes to resilience, making what you need to survive when and where you need it. As always, there is fine print, and a reason this kind of system doesn't already exist. There's a number of tools and specifications that need to exist first, or you may as well try to recreate the internet without having HTTP or HTML. The open hardware ecosystem is about a decade behind the software ecosystem, but this is changing rapidly. By looking into the ways that software and network design have evolved over the past decade, we can accelerate the process of catching up. So all these tools on the list are well-solved problems, things we take for granted now with all our DevOps tools, pipeline automation, version control, and so on. We just need to adapt these tools and the principles of mesh network design to the open supply chains that are already here and will continue to crop up as part of the response to our litany of impending disasters. In so doing, I believe we can all be better prepared for what lies ahead. Here is a partial list of the organizations working on solving this problem. We all remain committed to supporting, coordinating, and amplifying the efforts of the makers and engineers around the world, showing up in a crisis to help save lives. We know this is only the beginning, and we must all do what we can to work together if we are to make it through this century at all. Thank you for joining me for this talk. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, and please feel free to reach out to me if this sort of thing interests you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. I'd like to introduce Khali Churchill, malware analysis expert, as our next speaker.
Hello and welcome everybody to Malware and Biology. Here we're going to discover and introduce a new perspective into pairing malware and human biology to gain a greater understanding of exactly what we're dealing with in the world today and how to figure out how to forecast those trends. So I know everybody knows how to read, but I think that this quote is very important to have a foundational baseline to what we're going to be discussing. So the old performance measures have been how do we prevent someone from getting into the network, but the current measure should be how much time will it take for them to reach the network and how can we shorten that time to zero. This was a quote back in 2013, but it is entirely relevant today. It is the way that we need to be looking at these threats and the trends in order to properly be proactive or instead of reactive to these attacks or incidences. So what we're not, I wanted to throw in something funny because it is a very serious topic, but you know, computer virus spreads to humans. It's not really what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be comparing and creating a different perspective into that'll lead us into becoming semi-malware analyst experts. So there's two different types of evolutions. There's a biological evolution and a cultural evolution. And these correspond with primary succession for biological and secondary succession for cultural. And a biological evolution is going to be the traits that are transmitted, those hereditary genetic things that are slowly occurring, that slowly evolve into part of us. Whereas the cultural evolution is going to be, you know, transmissions between within or between generations, and it occurs at a much faster pace because there's already that baseline of the biological evolution there. This kind of builds off of that. And you can choose to accept or reject some of those cultural traits, or you know, like if you're going to celebrating Christmas and doing that tradition, or celebrating Hanukkah or whatever, and then whenever you become an adult, you're like, no, I don't want to do that. I want to do this instead, or celebrating it in a different way. That's going to be that cultural evolution. It's going to be those slight different variations and changes. So to kind of visualize this, the difference between primary and secondary succession, there's going to be the soil formation, those pioneer organisms, those really leachy organisms, right, that require something else in order to survive. They can't survive on their own. There's not soil, so it's a real harsh environment, right? It's real hard for anything to survive in it. And then there's going to be the secondary succession where there's a bunch of soil, there's that biological evolution for things to be able to grow off of, decide, make decisions. It's going to be able to really grow. So the evolution of malware, we're going to look a little bit into this. We're not going to look a whole lot into it, but the evolution of malware to kind of correlate between the two. So the Morris worm, there was actually one before that called the brain, and I actually think I have that one. So this is an actual insight into the brain. You can see it had the person's address, phone number, everything that we wish we could see whenever we just open up some malware to make things super simple. That was that primary succession. That was, this thing required something else to function. It was very basic, very, very open, and it was just very obvious. And then there's, then it started getting a lot more complex, like the secondary succession that we were talking about. It started going into the I love you virus. It started going into Zeus Trojan bank, where you could steal somebody's passwords, get their banking information. The Flame malware and Stuxnet were all part of a family. It became family of attacks, family of getting organized, which were choices, which is the secondary succession. So you can start seeing kind of that parallel between the primary and the secondary, seeing that the Stuxnet and the Flame started becoming that more cultural evolution. It started evolving from each other by slight variations. To visualize this connection, we're going to do a virus checklist. And you can see that here between these silly images where it infects a person and infects a computer. Then it wants to reproduce, spread, and then repeat that process, right? So we see that in a lot of just like ransomware attacks or any kind of really viruses. They just want to spread, reproduce, and get whatever they can from that host. And that's where we're at currently. But that's not where we're going to be staying at. So let's kind of look at evolution. So there's that regressive evolution, that parasitism, the brain malware, if you will. That's that early malware, that early, very unsophisticated, easy to figure out whose it was and where it originated from. Then you have those cellular origins, and that's kind of where we're at right now, is those cellular origins. So it's the malware equivalent to that is going to be like botnets, Zeus, configure worms, Mimi cats that are all over the place, that they require something else in order to activate, right? They require something else in order to live. They can't live on their own. They're still those biological entities, if you will. And then we have where we're going into, which is the cultural evolution, those independent entities, which is parallel to how our cellular origins originated. What we are today are sentient beings that can think on our own. We don't need anything else. We can go out into the wilderness and figure out how to survive on our own. We learn. And that's what we're doing. That's what we're dealing with now. So the Frankenstein virus is not the one that's in the wild right now. That one was a copy. It's a poor copy of the one that the Air Force bought. It was designed out of the University of Texas by a Kevin Hamlin. So this virus is actually true artificial intelligence, true learning. I'm not talking about the AI-based stuff that isn't really AI-based because it's still reliant on your input and your things. This is completely, this is something that completely survives on its own. And it is self-replicating. So it can create strains of itself and replicate itself to different infected computers. So here's a quick little look at Frankenstein's little inner guts, if you will. This is, I think, where some of the copycats that call themselves Frankenstein got their information from. But basically, it gets objects. It creates a blueprint of itself. It gets the blueprint from the computer, and it creates itself to where it automatically is whitelisted. So whatever it's doing, whatever it does, it thinks the computer believes that the super admin is doing that. That it is truly whitelisted. It is truly advanced. It is making itself. It's not something that the creator is telling it to get. It's not telling it to spread. The virus itself is built to build itself, spread on its own, and have its children spread and create different signatures, different hashes, to where it's never going to be the same. And that's kind of where we're trending today. And so how is this useful? Like, what can we do with this information? And what I wanted to do is provide a different perspective that equals the evolution that we go through, and remind everybody that we're the ones creating all this. We created this, therefore, just as how we believe, or if you believe in God, that God is a human being and not an animal, like we put ourselves into anything that we create, right? And that's going to be the same with viruses. It's going to evolve in a very similar way than how our subconscious and how our biology believes it should evolve. With those gaps in research, we can look at our human biology and create those connections and fill those gaps in research. We can fill those gaps in research by looking at our own research that's been done for hundreds of years, in terms of our own human biology, because this is something we created. So it's following along the lines quite drastically of our own evolution. So having those proactive vaccinations, and that's not talking about antivirus software, that's talking about actual vaccinations. How do we, instead of just being defensive, how do we proactively, offensively take care of viruses? And it's a debatable conversation that needs to be had, and it needs to have some kind of understanding within international law, within your own country's law, on how to actually proactively do that. But vaccinations could take care of whatever system that virus was coming from that was trying to infect yours, taking care of that virus on that system as well. So that's some topics, some really hot topics that really need more discussion on. we need terminology. And to look at all those, it's very simple. We are so focused on the technical aspect of things that we forget where all of this is coming from, and it's coming from ourselves. So looking at the biological evolutions and looking at ourselves and this virus, making those connections is going to be the key in having those productive conversations. So that's the current evolutionary path of malware. These are my many references. If there are any questions, please talk to turtlesnap@gmail.com. I'm pretty sure my contact information is going to be with this presentation. But if anybody has any questions on that, please let me know. I can also, walk through in detail some other topics or subjects that maybe sparked your interest a little bit more. But yes, and thank you. Again, my name is Turtlesnap, and I appreciate your attendance.
Thank you, Khali. Our next speaker is Veronica Schmid, Assistant Professor at North University.
Hi, everyone. I am Veronica Schmidt. I'm here today to talk to you guys about how forensics ended up saving my life. So first of all, who am I? I'm an assistant professor at North University in Norway. I'm also a director at DFI Labs that deals with incident response and digital forensics in South Africa. I'm also a security researcher for Medtronic in the US that deals with cardiac health, rhythm, products such as ICDs and pacemakers. More than that, I have a device myself. I have an ICD device from Medtronic. I'm an e-patient and a DEFCON boom. And more than that, a lethal forensicator. So first, before I can start, I need to explain to you guys what happened. November last year, I had trouble with losing heartbeats and my heart rate being very low. As you can see there, that is me a few days after I was resuscitated the first time in November, and there's my beautiful device. What I knew intuitively as a patient was that my device was not working the way that it should. Now your question is, how did you know? Well, first of all, my quality of life declined severely from about February that year. But I brought this up with my cardiologist. I explained the situation. But whenever we tested the device, it would test perfectly. It would say that it was functioning. But I had no events that matched my physical events taking place. So I decided that I would do what any other forensics person would do. I would trust the data. And I was adamant that there was a problem and I wanted to prove it, much like what we do every day in cases. So I had my doctor extract the device data. So what we are looking here is what the lower rate and the upper rate is of my heart. If you think back to the slide, you see that there are two little wires coming out of my medical device. One goes into my atrium and one goes into my ventricle. They sense, they pace, and they would administer a shock if needed. The data here showed that my device was pacing, but at one stage it stopped. Now the top level, as you can see, is what the previous device would normally do. 66%, 79%, 95%. So I was pacemaker and device dependent. However, soon this started to change. Soon there was no event or 1% of pacing, so there was a huge decline. In forensics, we always say trust in data. I decided to take what was on my iWatch and what was being recorded every day and do data analytics. I did forensics, and this is what it showed. That I had instances where my heart rate was going below 47, 45, 46, 41. There where you see that it went to 41 on the screen was when I was having a bradycardic attack, which needed in me needing to be resuscitated. As you can see, when I was manually paced, it would go up to 58, 59, and then drop again because I wasn't able to sustain this with my own heart. I am dependent on my device keeping me alive. But when we tested it using the manufacturer programmer, it would test correctly. I supplied this data to my doctor, who was yet to be convinced that this was a problem. People lie. Doctors are used to patients not telling the truth. So I went further and I continued investigating, sending him the data, because data is something that's fundamentally there. Because I knew the forensic process, I could apply it into my biomedical patient perspective. Many patients don't have that. But lots of people don't realize the data that an iWatch may contain. Later on, I'll show you how I confirmed that my device was indeed working by correlating different data sources, which is something we do every day in our lives. We now have the ability to track ourselves on our watches and see how we sleep, how our heart rates act. And this is a good thing because this could save lives and aid doctors in better identifying problems. Where you see on the screen, on the 23rd of November, I had a heart rate of 40. That was the second time that I was resuscitated due to my heart not being able to maintain a heartbeat. The device was surely not working as it's supposed to be, but doctors trust the data contained on the device. So, November and December, I spent mostly in hospital last year, pre-COVID. Thankfully, not this year yet. I managed to find, after the third cardiologist, someone that would look at the data as raw analytics, listen to me as a patient, and do an all-traditional test, which is called a tilt table test, where they strap you to a table, they make you stand, and they monitor your blood pressure and your heart rate. And we could identify that there was something diagnostically wrong with the device that I had. As you can see here, this is an example of the very old EKG test that they did, where they identified that my heart rate was beating fast irregularly and the pacemaker was not taking over pacing. We established that the leads at this point was a problem. How did we find it out? By doing traditional testing and fault examining and not trusting the device itself, but looking at multiple data sources. Now, here on the 6th of January, something super amazing happened in my life. I got a set of new leads and a new device. As you can see here, I'm sitting here. I look like any normal patient, any normal forensicator, rosy cheeks, no longer gray, and I have the energy to talk to you guys. But let's look at the data. The data now shows us where we were and where we are going. And I generally have a 56 beats per minute ratio to pacing, which is confirmed on my health app. As I can see, when I'm starting to feel ill, I see that my pacemaker takes over. Where you see the data type drop, it means my heart rate drops significantly and I'm unable to sustain a blood pressure reading. Now, the watch still showed post-surgery some low beats, but as you can see, the beats were lifted up. The important thing to notice is a patient will have a drop in data, but the pacemaker takes over and stabilizes that to a consistent beat, a consistent sinus rhythm. The amazing thing is when you pull data sources together, general forensics with biomedical forensics or forensic engineering, the picture of the well-being of a patient is so much clearer. Now, this was part of how normally my heart would beat. Now you see there are different rhythms, and this is generally when the pacemaker or the device takes over beating my heart. It is very important for me to have this confirmed as a patient. There is nothing worse than a patient with knowledge on how devices work, not trusting that device to sustain the life that I so dearly value. Now, as you can see, there are some discrepancies within the health kit and that of the device itself and even the app. As you can see, the two data sources that are here are from an application that monitors my pulse rate versus one that my watch recorded. And you will see that even though it says 58 to 56, there is a discrepancy in the rate, but it's in the general same ballpark. So we are still exploring how accurate this data can be correlated. In terms of fault finding, I was able to identify that my device was missing crucial beats of where it needed to step in and keep my heart beating at a constant race. The amazing thing happened about a few months ago when I started feeling ill because my heart rate was racing. Now, I can confirm at the time that screen grabs are done because, yes, I am that person that when I start feeling ill, I want to see what the data does because this is part of larger research that I'm doing. I was able to find where my defibrillator intervened in my therapy. I went from 146 to about, in a minute's time, to about 85 beats per minute to a more regular pulse rate. I am now confirming with the data that my device is acting the way that it should, that it's doing the therapies as it should. But what happens if a patient doesn't have the ability to do that? If I was anyone else than me, the ever so curious forensics person, I would not have been aware of the data available and the correlation to my biomedical device and be able to have saved my own life, to be able to advocate as an e-patient that there was something wrong. I am scared to think what the eventuality of that would have been. Now, we are at the questions page, but I want you guys to be able in a position to think about this. What data is contained on a forensic device? What are the file systems? What are the operating systems? How do they connect? How do they communicate? And I want you to apply that in the sense of general forensics. A lot of the medical devices we look at either have a FAT16 exFAT or other file system that it might have. It might be running operating systems such as Android. Some applications run on iOS. You have your bare metal devices. You have devices that run embedded Windows. We have devices that, for instance, run on VxWorks, which is a Linux flavor. It is normal forensics. Some of these connect over Ethernet and Wi-Fi and low-level Bluetooth. These are things that we deal with as forensics people in our general lives. We just don't apply them in the sense of medical or biomedical forensics. We seem to think that it's something foreign, something strange. When you start pulling through a medical device with a hex editor and go, old school forensics and map out the file system, you are able to distinguish patterns that are familiar. A lot of medical devices, especially the implantables that we deal with, run on flash memory. That means that the forensics that we will do will follow the approach of memory forensics. We deal with threads. We will be dealing with memory addresses and portions, that are volatile in nature. But more so than that, we need to consider that the devices that we look at might be implanted in a person. Now, I know in incident response, we want to isolate a machine. We want to keep it away from outside communication. But how do you place a human being in a Faraday cage? I want people to start the conversation and ask the questions. Learn what these devices are, how they work, but never lose sight. They are within a human being. They are part of a human being. I can probably talk and deep dive into the data much more, but there's limited scope and time. But I want others to investigate their own health data. It is as easy on an iOS device as exporting it to an XML and passing the data. You will be shocked and in awe on the amount of evidence that you can find on an iWatch, or even an Android watch. There has been cases where there has been looked at proving if someone was running or in a stationary position. I know there's researchers that have literally dragged, a friend along with an iWatch to see if they spike their heart rate. We have done tests ourselves, strapping an iWatch to my arm and running around Bletchley Park, then doing an EKG to see if there was any abnormal activity. That is what forensics is all about. It's research. It's looking at the data and letting the data tell a story. I was able to apply that from a patient perspective and advocate for the right for a new device or further investigation. And if you're a patient with a device, understand what data is contained on your device. Understand what is the therapies that is keeping your heart beating or your pancreas processing insulin. Having a medical device is trusting in the technology. And all we need is for that technology to break, to influence the future in such a pivotal way. The crux of the story is at the age 19, I got my first device. I've had some bad times, I've had some good times, but I've had the opportunity to have those times. I invite you to ask me questions, come with ideas, do the research, get involved in biohacking. Together we can find the answers to building these devices better. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. Our final two speakers of this session are Grant Ongert, CTO of Secure Delivery, and Nina Ali, Executive Director of the Biohacking.
Hello and welcome to the Threat Modeling in Healthcare session. I am Nina Ali. I'm the Executive Director of the Biohacking Village at DEF CON, and my bio is here. I've done biomedical cybersecurity, translational medicine, things. I have the honor and privilege of being accompanied by Mr. Grant Ongers, who will now give his bio, and we will then start talking about threat modeling in healthcare.
Thanks, Nina. So there's a ton of information on the slide. What you really want to take away from that is that if you want to get hold of me for OWASP business, because I'm very heavily involved with the OWASP community, grant@ongers.owas.org. Otherwise, if it's something commercial, grant@securedelivery.io. We do quite a lot of work in this space, both as part of the community as well as commercially. I've been involved in the community for a long time. I really am keen on what it is we're doing here. Everything from DEF CON right the way through to OWASP and all the parts in between. Also, plenty of time doing it. And then jumping in just to kind of set the scene a little bit around threat modeling generally. Threat modeling is essentially about looking at your applications or looking at your environment as an attacker would. The number one way that threat modeling is usually done is using the mnemonic STRIDE, which is spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. And I've seen Adam Shostak do that so many times now that every time I hear the mnemonic in my head, I see his face. Basically, it's about looking at systems and trying to understand how they can possibly be broken. And each of these areas, each of these 6 areas of interest are types of vulnerabilities that potentially an attacker could exploit, and the results they're trying to get involved with. So where spoofing is pretending to be something they're not, tampering is about messing with the data in some way, repudiation is about hiding, concealing who they are while they're doing things. Information disclosure is taking the data out, which is what they're primarily trying to do. Denial of service, mainly a skiddy thing where they knock your services off the network. And elevation of privilege, which is the crown jewel, right? That's now I've gotten in and I can do other more interesting things on systems that aren't exposed, or at least weren't supposed to be exposed. Outcomes from a traditional threat modeling exercise is a threat model. And this is a nice template that you can grab from the OWASP threat modeling cookbook. And there's a link down at the bottom there that will help you grab it. But the threat modeling, generically, that's what we're talking about. Understanding a system or a solution from the point of view of an attacker.
So thank you for the introduction to threat modeling. I want to go over a couple of questions just so that people understand the intricacies of how healthcare works and how threat modeling can layer over healthcare to to make it more pronounced and to give us more insight. So why does healthcare need a threat model? And just from my own personal insight into it, healthcare is a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week, 365, 66 on leap years day organism that is constantly and consistently moving. And it's exceptional because it's not just people that are inside it moving, it's different devices that are moving along with it. And if you don't have that list of assets that are moving around, or at least in your place, your industry, you can get a little lost. And this healthcare industry is different from other industries in that if one thing changes, a human is directly affected by it. So with all of that backend and insight, for you, what is your takeaway for why healthcare needs a threat model?
So I guess a lot of threat modeling is understanding how pieces work together, because it's usually where we glue stuff together that the glue isn't quite as cemented as it should be. So in the environment you've just described, which is lots of different systems, lots of different components, all interacting with each other in various ways, there's a lot of that cement going on, a lot of that connectivity happening. Any environment that looks like that is going to be complicated to threat model because it's a complex system. It's made more complex by the fact that you have stuff that belongs to us, the hospital, the provider, whatever it might be, and stuff that we allow into our environment in some way, possibly giving it some level of privilege, giving it some level of access, allowing it access to a public Wi-Fi spot or something like that. Or even I need to interact with something on a patient and I need to connect my devices to the patient in some way, right? So all of these things make the model more complex. And it's important to understand what the model looks like in order to be able to create the right defenses. I think threat modeling for healthcare is probably one of the most complex systems there is, primarily because we don't know what all the moving parts are. And we have very little control over, 20-30% of the pieces that move in and out?
Mm-hmm. So I love that you brought that up. So just from the threat modeling standpoint, the mindset, how would a healthcare organization start to threat model? So as a proviso to this question, the FDA in the United States has started to ask medical device manufacturers to threat model their device so that those threat models and the device can be brought in to the hospital ambulatory care center, and they give it all as a package and say, here. So
what the FDA has asked medical device manufacturers to do is unfortunately more than what you've just described. What you've described is exactly what they should be doing, i.e. this is a black box, this is a thing. We, the device manufacturers, have taken the thing apart and we understand all the pieces that fit together inside it. We understand the threat model for this device. But this black box has a bunch of inputs and has a bunch of outputs. These are the interfaces that it has with your systems. These are how you can expect it to interact with those systems. And these are the threats we think you can expect. But that should be all they give you, right? Black box, inputs and outputs, threats potentially impacting those inputs and outputs. I think it's a good thing if that's what they were doing. And I think it would be a great way to help hospitals or care centers integrate new devices into their systems. But it also only covers a very small amount of those devices. So what do you about the rest? What do you do about the random pieces that have walked in off the street attached to humans?
And the legacy devices. Because we have all of these brand new, magical, glittery, wonderful things that are walking in and they have a lot of supervision already built into them. But then there's also these other legacy devices that were built to last 10, 15, 20 years that have no coverage around them. And we have to layer all of these different things around it.
And they're not going away anytime soon, right? Because it's an X-ray machine and it still does X-rays, right? There's no reason to replace it. It was an expensive machine when they bought it. And the manufacturer is not going to be doing massive updates to systems like that. And if they are, does that fall under the same guidelines? Does a threat model have to come with an update now? So yes, the whole IoT space is going to have the same problem. Medical devices more so than the rest, because legacy will be around forever.
So how does the threat modeling account for vulnerabilities versus exploits?
So exploits are, I know how to break the thing. Vulnerabilities are simply, this is a thing that can be potentially broken. With that concept, I mean, it's strictly speaking, not entirely the whole story, but just broadly speaking, if we think of it in those terms, if you know about exploits on a particular device, you have to defend against them, right? Because there is a way in the wild to break this thing, to make it do something it shouldn't. Vulnerabilities are what we're really looking for with threat modeling, because we want to prevent our systems being held hostage by something that suddenly appears, by an exploit that we haven't heard of before, purely because we know that it could be vulnerable to something. So yeah, I guess we have to cater for the vulnerabilities, because exploits we should definitely already cover.
I want to talk about a Black Swan event that recently happened, and I want your input on this. And I'm going to read from my notes just so I don't get it completely and utterly wrong. So there was recently an event at UHS, which is an American hospital system. And unfortunately, they had a trick bot enter their systems, which are botnets that are networks of computers secretly infected by remote controlled malware. And Microsoft ended up taking back control and command of their servers so that they could take down this botnet and disable the IPs that were used by this botnet. So again, because it is current state a Black Swan event, how can we take this model that just happened? How can we integrate that into our threat models, if possible?
Well, so firstly, we need to threat model for the vulnerabilities that we know exist in our existing hardware, our existing solutions. So we need to first understand what those vulnerabilities look like and get a good grasp on how they potentially could be exploited. TrickBot invading hospitals is, as you said, Black Swan. It's unusual. It isn't what it was designed to do. But it obviously exploited a known vulnerability in a system to get in. That vulnerability probably was known to the manufacturer, or should have been known to the manufacturer, and potentially that should have been disclosed in some way. If you have a solution that uses X, Y, and Z, and you know that you're using X, Y, and Z, and there are vulnerabilities in X, Y, and Z that can be exploited, it's a good idea to make sure that you understand what those vulnerabilities are and that you model around that. I don't want to hammer too harshly on them, because let's get the basics right. Broadly cover most of the things before we worry about these very specific, very unusual, very hard to predict events.
So I realize that I spoke from a point of view where I know things, and I want to take a step back. A lot of hospitals may have IT folks,
Yep.
They may not have IS folks. So thinking in terms of that, as well as information security folks, what kind of education does someone need to start threat modeling?
So although threat modeling is something that a lot of IS folks do, that isn't how I advocate for it. The world that security delivery comes from is primarily in the actual application development phases. And we advocate for threat modeling to be done by developers. If you're threat modeling a solution, an operational system in production, as in more than just a single application, you're modeling a bunch of interconnected devices like a hospital, it should be done by individuals who understand how those pieces are fitting together. So it is an IT thing, right? This is an IT person who knows the solutions that he's managing, how they exactly are supposed to interact with each other. Now, it's about the management, because there are some systems that are completely unmanaged by hospital IT, that they're managed by a medical device manufacturer or something like that. And then the responsibility falls on those individuals to ensure that the threat model is clear. But it is about the management. It should never be a security thing, right? It's about protecting the things that I'm managing and the things that I'm maintaining. and that's an operations side thing. And if you're building, it's a development side.
Right. So it's starting to set that baseline.
Yeah.
So understandably, we are doing threat models for things that we are known and that we can account for. How do you manage shadow IT in a threat model? Because healthcare has a lot of different things going on.
Yep.
They could move through that. So ideas.
Shadow IT is incredibly difficult to combat, and you'd probably be better off combating the causes of shadow IT than trying to deal with the result of having shadow IT in your environment. It's really difficult to deal with a server that you never knew existed unless you're doing like random scans and you're killing devices that you don't recognize. And then, of course, you risk killing things that are critical to the running of the hospital, because that shadow IT might be exactly how the hospital is running.
Mm-hmm.
Without that piece that we don't know about as IT, the hospital doesn't function. So why is it shadow IT? Deal with that side of it. Honestly, if you have a shadow IT environment, you're dealing with that problem. You need to look at the environment that created it and deal with that. People are not wanting to run their own servers under their desks because they think it's fun. Generally, it's because they need it for some reason, and you haven't accounted for that.
A lot of industries are starting to move over into zero trust. And I think healthcare is going to maybe be one of those first adopters because of the way that it's built. So do you have any thoughts on zero trust plus threat modeling plus healthcare equals?
Well, so zero trust is an approach to connecting devices to each other, connecting systems together, a way of exchanging information between systems that requires both solutions, both ends of the communication string, to identify themselves and then ensure that a trust link is established. And that is transient. It happens for the exchange that we need to do right now. It's a solution that was worked out quite well by Google. And there are tons of papers, really good papers by the Google crew on how zero trust should be implemented, how they've done it.
So just to add on to that, it works.
It assumes a completely violent, aggressive, non-safe network environment.
Exactly. So before it was trust but verify, and now it's never trust, always verify.
Correct. Yeah. And the primary thing about zero trust is we spend a lot of our time talking about how I have this thing and it's inside my network, it's behind my firewalls. So when this thing wants to talk to other things, I just let it because it's on the same side of the firewall. Everything must be hunky-dory. Mm-hmm. We kind of build these whole castle structures where we put some nice big walls and moats around it. We layer up our defenses because defense in depth is good, but we still just assume that if you're inside the castle, inside the moat, you're allowed to do whatever you like. And that isn't the reality, right? The true way of doing things, or the zero trust way of doing things, is that depending on the service that you're interacting with, there's a different requirement for proving identity and for proving that you have the not just that you're the right person to come in, but you're allowed to do the things that you're going to be doing.
So you're the elevation of privilege as well.
Yeah.
Right.
So given zero trust as a way of approaching building services, well, yes, it solves most of the problems, if not all of them. And it makes the shadow IT thing go away completely, because the shadow IT components can't talk to the rest of the infrastructure, can't talk to the rest of the services, unless they have a way of authenticating against those services. And if they have a way of authenticating against those services, it means it's probably using private key encryption, as it should be doing, which means that it isn't actually shadow IT anymore because we gave them keys. And if we gave them keys, then we should know what they're doing. Mm-hmm. It does mean that threat modeling becomes incredibly simpler. It is much easier to create threat models in a zero trust environment because you don't have to worry about other things that aren't in the diagram. Because if they're not in the diagram, they literally can't talk to things that are in the diagram and therefore can be ignored. Because that is a big part of the leap of faith that we take in doing threat models, is that we have a picture that is as close to a real thing as possibly. With zero trust, it must be the real thing, right? The model gets better.
Right, this is what we hope for. So I want to make sure that people understand that there are resources for all of these things. And I know you work extensively with OWASP and putting out tons of information on this. So if there are any sites or things that they can reach you on, quick 2 minutes, 2 sentences on that. So
the best place to reach me, if you want to talk about this sort of thing, is probably on Twitter, REWTD on Twitter. If you're wanting to look for resources that the foundation has on threat modeling, there's a lot. The OWASP.org website will lead you off to everything. There are tons of projects around threat modeling and lots of individuals who are very active in that area. So please get involved in those and take a look at what they've got. The cheat sheets are probably the best places to start. In fact, the cheat sheets are the best place to start with anything that OWASP potentially has. And it's also really nicely laid out. So that's where I'd suggest going. There are other resources for threat modeling. One that you've actually mentioned to me in the past, Nina, so perhaps give them a shout out here as well. Includes no dirt.
Well, thank you. So just at the Biohacking Village, we have a hospital set up that mimics a real life hospital, and we do all kinds of vulnerability tests on it, as well as individual devices where the hacker can have a face-to-face moment with the medical device manufacturer and give them the vulnerability and say, this is what's wrong, and go through it. And we've actually done a lot of really good work there and helping patient care and patient safety through that. There's another enterprise called Omada Health, and what they did was create a learning mechanism, a learning tool called Includes No Dirt. And what they've done is include the medical side with the threat modeling so that you can make it easier as a learning tool. And additionally, at the Biohacking Village, we have a device lab where we have the medical device manufacturers come in with their devices, and they have face-to-face conversations with the hacker community, and they can discuss the pen tests and any other vulnerabilities face-to-face in real time and come up with ways to mitigate those issues. So on that note, thank you so much for listening to our talk. Grant, thank you for being here with me, and thank you Cyberweek for inviting us.
Thanks, Nina. It's always great to get a chance to chat to you, and thank you, Cyberweek.
Up next, allow me to introduce our first panel, Securing Medical Networks. The panel will discuss what are the challenges in securing medical networks and how it is different from traditional IT networks. In addition, it will discuss the three-way collaboration between SOMPO, Medicate, and Asuta, bringing a new and unique cybersecurity solutions to the Japanese market. Moderated by Omri Green, partner at Grove Ventures, and panelist Tamir Ronen, CISO at Asuta Medical Centers, Asaf Marco, GM at SOMPO Cybersecurity, and Jonathan Langer, CEO and founder at Medicate.
Hi everyone, we have today panel about securing medical networks. So maybe let's start with a quick introduction. Jonathan, from the US, you want to start?
Thank you. Hello everyone. I'm Jonathan Langer. I'm the CEO of Medicate. We're a healthcare cybersecurity company, and happy to be joining today.
Cool. So Asaf, maybe?
Hi, my name is Asaf. I'm from SOMPO Cybersecurity, head of product strategy.
Amir.
Hi, my name is Tamir Ronen. I'm the Chief Information and Cybersecurity at Asuta Medical Centers for 7 years now. Asuta Medical Centers is the largest private hospital network in Israel, operating head hospitals and medical centers from north to south.
Cool. And I'm Omri. I'm the moderating. I'm a partner in Grove Venture, investing in Israel in early stage and deep tech companies. Before this role, I was in Clarity of Team A, and I had my own company called ICS Square doing cybersecurity. So I will try to do my best to make it interesting for everyone. So Tamir, so you are the Chief Information Security Officer of Asuta. Maybe explain us, why do medical networks, you need cybersecurity, and what is wrong? Everything is working, right? besides Corona, everything's okay. So,
first of all, there's a lack of visibility. The traditional solutions provide minimum information about medical devices, such as IP addresses. Most of the traditional solutions cannot provide useful information about the identity of the medical device, its version, security vulnerabilities, and communication between devices. There is no information about default passwords used to access those devices, which are probably the same for every device worldwide. In addition, every medical institute needs to have a live inventory of the medical devices with all the technical information I mentioned earlier that show you the overall risk assessment of connecting medical devices to the IT network.
Cool. And I guess, Tamir, you saw many solutions, right? Before choosing, right? How many solutions you see? I don't know. Every month, every year, in the last 2 years?
I see a lot of solutions, but in this area, there are several good solutions on the market.
Cool. And Jonathan, you know, even me, I tried, you know, to go to Asuta and sell him something, but I was not successful many years ago. And you started a company, right, in this domain of securing medical devices. Why did you do that, right? You can do so many startups in so different, many verticals, many domains. Why to go to medical?
Well, that's a good question. Certainly one that the investors usually ask also, so it makes sense. I'd say there are three main parameters that I was considering. One, we wanted to select a domain where there is a deep technological problem to be solved. And I totally agree with Tamir that some of the pre-existing security infrastructure can't really handle, for many technological reasons, this domain very well. And so we wanted to focus on that. The other parameter was, I'd say, a real pressing need for this kind of technology. And we definitely felt that the market had spoken, especially after the WannaCry attacks, which kind of pushed the market in this direction. And last, healthcare is a big market. So for startup companies out there, on the one hand being focused, but on the other hand seeing a fairly large total addressable market, all of these three parameters together made sense for us, and that's how we started the company.
Cool. Can you tell us a bit more about Medigate?
Sure. So we're a 3-year-old company. Started the company in 2017, really under the premise of healthcare security as our main focus, securing everything in a healthcare environment, medical devices, IoT, clinical assets, and so on. The business has been progressing well, and at this point, just 3 years after, it seems like yesterday, we're getting close to 100 people in the organization, mostly focused on the American market, but not just the American market, which I'm sure we'll talk about today. And we're looking forward to the future.
Cool. Asaf, I know a bit about Sompo, but maybe you can explain what is the relevance between Sompo insurance company and cybersecurity?
Well, yes, Sompo is one of the biggest insurance companies in Japan and very innovative. They're very innovative by building and creating a digital lab to create a digital business in Japan and around the world. The first spin-off of this project was the security venture that I am in. The vision is to build a one-stop shop for cybersecurity services, first in Japan for the domestic market and then expand internationally. What we're doing actually in several verticals and several markets, from enterprise to SMB, OT, and now, of course, hospitals. Maybe we can talk about the hospital sector later on, but in a nutshell, this is us.
Well, so I think maybe Asaf, you can continue. And I have the rumor, I think someone told me before this session, that all the three of you are working together, right? Collaborating. And it's a bit, you know, quite unusual. So can you explain the connection between insurance company from Japan, startup from Israel with a CEO in New York, and a big hospital in Israel. So maybe Asaf, you want to start? And...
Yeah, actually, it started from a meeting with a very famous hospital in Japan that has a vision how to protect itself. One of the things was medical devices. And then we started actually this journey. We started the journey. My first call was to Sompo Digital Lab, and they try to create an opportunities for us professionally. We talked with many companies, and we found Medicaid as the best partner for us. And before that, when we start to analyze the market, we saw a few engines and a few business opportunities. Sompo is covering 60% of medical insurance customers in Japan. Together, we also found there's going to be a regulation led by the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, which can be an engine for developing regulations in Asia and in Japan. And as I mentioned before, together with our insurance company, Backbone, it seems like the right thing for us. And after that, we met Asuta. Also, it was a great opportunity. Asuta, maybe Tamir can also talk about it, but they have capabilities to create a consulting service for hospitals in many aspects, and cyber is one of them. We love this idea. We love the reputation of Asuta, and together we are trying to build a consulting service as well. It's still early stage in Japan. It's not in the same maturity level as the US, but we will get there.
Cool. Jonathan, maybe you want to say what you are doing in Asuta? What is the plan?
Absolutely. So when we started looking at the Japanese market, it was probably a year before I met Asaf. There was one thing that I understood is that there is no real way for me as a small startup company to approach this market without a partner. And we started looking at what we can do and what would be the best avenue to proceed. And that's where we met. We incidentally, or not incidentally, met Asaf and the Sompo team, and realized that this would be an excellent partner to drive our company into the Japanese market. And I think it's a very unique positioning that Sompo has, because on the one hand, Israeli, so there's good communication between us and an understanding of our needs and also our constraints. And on the other hand, of course, very much entrenched in the Japanese market and have the right relationships and the right organization culture and so on to be successful in that region as well. So it was a good combination, and the realization that partnership is a necessity in order to be successful in Japan, which brought us together.
Great. Tamir, what did we miss? What we should know about this collaboration?
We also bring vast experience in security medical IT networks, especially in clinical processes. We are leading in cyber innovation and collaborate with startups. And we also search for a good partner in order to expand our consulting outboard.
Cool. So Jonathan, we are part of Cyberweek. It's a big global event of cyber. You're located in the US. Good for you. You're not in lockdown like us in Israel. And I guess if you are, you are in the US is a huge market for you, right? So, you know, so many entrepreneurs in the crowd, they try to understand why you also looking on Japan. So if you can share a bit, you know, success stories so far in Japan, from your past, from this company, it will help everybody.
Absolutely. So I think that every entrepreneur and every company, there's always, on the one hand, you want to be focused on the relevant market and you want to be execution oriented, but it's also important to dream and to see the big picture. And early on, myself and everyone at Medigate were fascinated by the Japanese market, first and foremost because we felt that there's a deep appreciation for quality, for precision, and for good technology. And we thought like that's a great place to start off with. The other piece was, and now I'm talking about healthcare, is that the size of market in Japan for healthcare is huge. You'd be surprised. There are just a very large sector, even compared to Europe and the United States. So it's not a marginal opportunity. So we definitely felt that there was a potential.
More than 8,000 hospitals.
Yeah, more than 8,000 hospitals, which is just it's an incredible number. So of course we didn't want to neglect that opportunity at all. The one thing that we wanted to do, and this is where also fate came into the picture, is that we understood that with Japan you have to have a good partner, a solid partner to work with, because there is no the opportunity to sell directly. It's probably not the best path to go, especially when you're spread thin like any startup is.
And especially, Jonathan, in Corona, I'm not sure it's really possible right now to do that.
Oh, even before and in Corona, it's the situation is exacerbated tenfold. So this is where also the relationship with Sompo and just good vibes and good collaboration came into play, and enabled us to move forward. And in terms of success stories, I think that we're doing projects with Sompo in the region. I think they're successful. I think we're driving value. And I think it also helped us to understand the unique needs of the Japanese market and the way to approach them, which is certainly different than what we're seeing in other regions. And we think that there's still the best is yet to unfold, and we're excited to continue.
Great. So this collaboration sounds amazing. And, you know, Asaf, you want to add anything?
Yes, I just want to say that any trip in Japan, it's a long and very deep journey, especially of course business journey. I'm having a discussion with Jonathan's team every other week, and I think they're now only starting to understand how deep are we going to go. There are many requests and questions from the customers, for partners, and so on. But I think that Medigate is strong enough and capable enough to be with us in this journey.
Cool. And Tamir, you know, there are so many Chief Information Security Officers with us this week. Do you have any additional tips for the audience about how to ensure security and safety in medical networks, in hospitals? It's pretty challenging, you know, so maybe you can share a bit more.
First of all, the medical devices needs to be in separate will, but the more important things that you need a dedicated solution regarding the medical devices. As I said, there are several good solutions on the market. And after applying this solution, you will discover things you never knew existed in your IT network. So visibility is one of the important things for increasing security and to mitigate the risk.
Cool. And Asaf, it's pretty interesting, I think, for the crowd to understand what next in Sompo. What are you looking for? What type of other solution for hospitals, for other markets in Japan? Anything you want to add on that?
We are going in many directions. Actually, this year we kind of focusing and building and expanding what we have. we are going to launch our consulting OT consulting service next month. It's going to be very interesting. We already have a few customers in this area. So that's our current situation, and hopefully we can expand in a good way.
Cool.
In the next few months.
And I try to ignore, but it's not possible. So maybe, Asaf, Jonathan, Tamir, maybe you can share a bit about the challenges in the last 1 year in COVID, approaching new clients, approaching new startups, doing collaboration, installing in hospitals. So maybe Asaf, you can start, and Jonathan continue.
Yeah, I think working from home is a challenge by itself. In our company, it was very interesting to see in Japan relationship, and seeing everybody physically has a lot of contribution. Taking this out, it's complete changes the culture. My team is in Japan. I'm currently in Israel. So how do you lead? How do you manage this kind of situation? Is also very interesting challenge. And when it comes to customer, I think everybody's everybody's working with video call. So it's I think it's challenging, but it's possible.
Jonathan, are you able to do any face-to-face meetings in US?
So very little is the answer. Just local things in the city where we get the opportunity. And I think maybe similar to Asaf, what we feel in healthcare is a key characteristic is that there's a lot of trust. Not cybersecurity in general is a lot about trust, but certainly healthcare as well. So a lot of our, I'd say, our method was to meet our stakeholders, to meet internally, to have deep discussions, and this just isn't available. But have the business and life adapts to new realities very, very fast, and we've gone to a new operational mode where we're taking advantage as much as possible of the digital medium, and it's working out just like every organization out there. But we had to modify our processes pretty significantly. I will also say more on a positive note. I do think that it's also opening up opportunities and new thoughts, this new normal situation that we're all part of. And in our space, I feel that there are two things that are happening. One is, I'd say, definitely acceleration of digital trends in healthcare. It's amazing what's happening. I like to call this digitalization at the edge. So telemedicine and more digitalization at the outpatient facilities, because people don't want to go to hospitals because it's dangerous right now because of the pandemic. Want to be more in safer locations, and I think it's creating a very new and interesting digital trend. That there are also opportunities around this from a cybersecurity perspective or a digital transformation perspective. And the other trend that we're seeing is really focus on operational efficiency. Some of the healthcare systems that we're working with, obviously their revenues have been decreased because of the situation. So everyone's more cognizant about budget right now. So maybe going back to Tamir's comment about inventory, when you look at these devices, being able to streamline processes and to be more efficient with regard to the usage of the assets in the enterprise, and tying that around to operational efficiency of the overall enterprise, it's making a whole lot of sense right now for organizations out there. And I also think that it opens up an opportunity for technologies like our technology and others out there in the market to be impactful in that area as well. So that's, I say, the main things that I'm seeing from where I sit.
This is perfect. And Tamir, you want to add anything? Anything from your view? Maybe you increasing your budget, the budget going lower, you're doing more new project next year. What do you see in your Suta?
No budget.
Nobody.
Good.
Many more employees work remotely. There are more attempts to send sensitive information out of the organization. We receive 5 times more phishing emails than the average, and there are many more attempts to receive sensitive clinical information by external parties regarding the COVID-19 virus. So it's very challenging.
And this is very interesting. I didn't think about it. Yeah. So I think we are in the end of the panel. Anyone want to add anything that I missed and you want to ask yourself? Asaf, Jonathan, Tamir.
Maybe just one comment on my end, since we're talking about the Japanese angle. So everyone that's contemplating looking into this market or working in this market, I would say this, just some advice. Definitely work with a partner. And number two, it's a fascinating journey. It's eye-opening working with the Japanese market, and it's a lot of fun. It really builds character. Yeah, it builds character, and it's interesting. So I would definitely recommend looking at this and not straying away.
And number 3, you need a good partner, right? You don't, not just a partner. You need a very good partner, right?
Yes, absolutely. You need a good partner and a committed partner, and which luckily we have.
Yeah, it goes both ways, absolutely. Yeah, let's do the same thing next year. See what Jonathan reaction will be.
That's a good exercise.
It's going to be a very tough job for them.
Well, I will send you a Zoom invite for Cyberweek 2021. Hopefully it will be face-to-face and not via Zoom from New York, Kfar Saba and Ramat HaChayal. So maybe we can meet face-to-face. It will be much fun, right?
Absolutely.
It might be the new normal, face-to-face conferences.
Yeah, well, we're looking forward to that.
Perfect. So thank you very much, and it was great talking today. And hope to see you face-to-face after the lockdown in Israel.
Thank you.